The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Over the weekend, the big news was that the meeting was going to happen. Donald Trump was going to be meeting with Kim Jong-un, the North Korean leader, to negotiate, at least as far as Donald Trump wanted us to believe, North Korea's nuclear disarmament. And the Trumpists were just on fire. You should have seen them all over my Twitter account all over the weekend saying, look at what Donald Trump has been able to accomplish. This man is a genius. He is a master deal maker and negotiator. You all said he'd get nothing done here, and he's made more progress with North Korea, getting Kim Jong-un to be willing to meet with him. It is incredible. Wow, wow, wow. And then, of course, we had to inject some connection to the real world in this entire thing. And indeed, we're now learning that it all appears to have stemmed, I don't even know if I can call it a misunderstanding, but sort of stemmed from Trump's incompetence and lack of knowledge of how anything works with North Korea. Now, those are pretty big claims I'm making. I should have to defend them, and I will. This all started when a South Korean official named Chung Il-yong was at the White House. And according to the New York Times, Trump asked Chung to tell him about his meeting with Kim Jong-un. And Chung told Trump, truthfully, as far as we know, that Kim Jong-un is interested in meeting with Donald Trump. Trump immediately says, yes, I will do it. And then the headlines just explode to something along the lines of Trump to meet with Kim Jong-un. Now, the way it was being reported and understood by lots of people was that the breaking news was that Kim Jong-un was willing to meet with Trump. If all along you believe that Kim Jong-un was not willing to meet with Trump or former American presidents, when you hear a headline that says, hey, things have changed, Kim Jong-un is now willing to meet with Trump, you think, wow, that is major progress. We've gone from North Korean leadership being unwilling to meet with American presidents to all of a sudden Trump is president of the United States. He talks about Little Rocket Man. He talks about a bloody nose strike. And next thing you know, everything changes and Kim Jong-un wants to meet with Donald Trump. But that's what the Trumpists and Trump himself seemed to be missing over the entire weekend, which is that North Korea, under Kim Jong-un, under Kim Jong-il, they've always wanted to meet in person with an American president. It's the U.S. who has chosen not to do it unless there were some preconditions imposed, concessions agreed to by the North Korean side. It's not newsworthy at all that Kim Jong-un wants to meet with Donald Trump. The newsworthy part would be the American policy change of Trump meeting with Kim Jong-un with no preconditions. And so immediately, the White House started walking all of this back, and our favorite press secretary, Sarah Huckabee Sanders, told reporters a couple days ago that actually, no, Trump is not just going to show up and meet with Kim Jong-un. There need to be concrete concessions made beforehand, and you'll notice this is a basically completely opposed situation, a different situation than what the headlines were claiming.
This won't be any more than a photo op. Kim Jong-un gets his equal footing, in his view, on the world stage with the leader of the free world, and the president gets nothing.
Yeah, I definitely don't think that the president's getting nothing when we've already said, and frankly I've said it many times since walking in here in the last 10 minutes, that the president will not have the meeting without seeing concrete steps and concrete actions take place by North Korea. So the president would actually be getting something, and frankly the world would be getting something. If we can get to a place where North Korea is denuclearizing, that is a massive step, and it's something that will make the entire globe much safer. And even President Moon has said that this is because of the leadership of President Trump.
Right. So after all the headlines and all the tweets from the Trumpists about Trump the hero, the real situation is that the American president is willing to consider meeting with Kim Jong-un only with preconditions and concessions, which is exactly the old policy. Nothing has changed. That has been the situation for a very long time in the United States. Before Trump, North Korean leaders wanted to meet with American presidents, and American presidents were only willing to consider that if North Korea made concessions before the meeting, which they've not been willing to do. And now, during Trump, it's the exact same scenario. So Trump shot his mouth off because he believed that it was notable that Kim Jong-un wanted to meet with him when it was not. That's really the funniest part of all of this. When the headlines broke, the Trumpists thought that this was major. And also, some of them thought that this meant Kim Jong-un was ready to disarm, that wanting a meeting with Trump meant Kim Jong-un was ready to meet and say, I'm giving up my nukes. Kim Jong-un has no interest in giving up his nukes. He wants to meet with President Trump to convey power, that he got a meeting with Trump, and he'll know that if he gets the meeting, it would be because he has the nukes and people are afraid of how he might use them. The last thing that Kim Jong-un is going to do is meet with Trump to get rid of the nukes. And you've got to put yourself in his shoes, right? If you're in the situation of Kim Jong-un in North Korea, Kim Jong-un knows that the nukes are hugely important as a bargaining chip. And this also applies to newer reports from the last few hours that Kim Jong-un wants a peace treaty with the United States. This, by some on the Trumpist right, is being reported as, look at what Kim Jong-un is willing to do for Trump. Kim Jong-un has always wanted others to do for them things, and that's what this is. It's not take my nukes and nothing bad will happen. It's we want the U.S. to agree to X, Y, Z. More than likely, that would include a formal end to the Korean War, which, from the point of view of Kim Jong-un, would necessitate the total removal of all U.S. forces from South Korea, which is not going to happen. So listen, I'm not saying this is a bad idea. I would love for the United States to reduce its military footprint around the world. I would love for there to be actual productive disarmament talks with North Korea. But the fantasy that Trump achieved something big and that Kim Jong-un is just willing to give everything up now because of the power of Donald Trump, it is an absolute and total fantasy.
Yeah, I'm a little disappointed because it doesn't seem like this meeting is going to happen after all.
No.
And I think only good can come from this meeting, right? You have two people sitting at a table together.
Oh.
We know that Trump is a good schmoozer. He can wine and dine Kim Jong-un, and maybe they'll both come out of it feeling better.
Is that tongue-in-cheek or is that for real?
No, I really think that. I remember Obama
no.
during the campaign in 2008 talked about how he would meet with Iran without preconditions.
Yeah.
Is it so bad if Trump does it with Kim Jong-un?
I think the difference is if you get two megalomaniacs who do have access to nuclear weapons together in a room with each other, when one of those megalomaniacs also knows nothing about anything, I think it's a recipe for disaster. I think the way that if you're going to do this seriously, right? If you're going to do this seriously, what you have to do is say, great, we're going to have a North Korean-U.S. summit, probably with South Korean officials as well, and maybe even other allies. And they are going to really do the bulk of the actual negotiation without the megalomaniacs in the room. And then once we come to what will be in principle an agreement, we will have something more ceremonial for Trump and Kim Jong-un to get together and maybe shake hands or whatever. And I want to be clear, I would want that to happen. I've been pointing to the North Korean situation as one that we would all benefit from having a resolution to, but we've got to be realistic. And the idea that you're going to put two megalomaniacs in the room and everything's just going to work out great, I think it's laughable, but it's also laughable that Trump and the Trumpists fell hook, line, and sinker for something that's not news. Kim Jong-un has been thrilled for years about the possibility of being seen as a serious enough player geopolitically to meet with an American president. And it's been the United States who has said, hold on a second, if we're going to do that, then we're going to need some concessions. And yet, this is the latest episode, by the way, in Sarah Huckabee Sanders' regular series of, look, the president clearly meant X, even though the president said Y. That should be like the epitaph on her burial headstone. Look, the president clearly meant, because all she does is tell us what it actually means when Trump says, we're going to meet with Kim Jong-un.
Yeah, she's still my second favorite White House press secretary. I like Sean Spicer even more.
Yeah, I find Spicer less vile, I guess is what I would say, but I don't know that I really am I don't believe either of them is contributing to the forward progress of democracy in sort of any major way. I have amazing news that is also sort of disappointing news. Stephen Colbert on the CBS Late Show with Stephen Colbert talked about Melania Trump liking a tweet with a David Pakman Show video questioning how she got her Einstein visa. He did this late last week, Friday night, on national television. That's the good news. The downside is that the David Pakman Show is not actually mentioned at any point. So let me catch you up on this entire thing. We're now about 10 days ago, we did a story questioning how Melania Trump got an EB-1 visa, also known as an Einstein visa, also known as an extraordinary ability visa. And a few days later, a Twitter user named David Amrod tweeted a link to that video, and the official verified Melania Trump Twitter account with nearly 1 million followers liked the video. By the next morning, that like had been removed, and it was no longer under the list of liked videos by Melania Trump. And this triggered a ton of news articles about this, including one in Newsweek and a whole bunch of other articles. And the articles mentioned specifically the liked tweet was one of a video from the David Pakman Show. It explained our position on the hypocrisy of this visa given Donald Trump's immigration ideas. All well, fine, and good. And then the story gets picked up by Stephen Colbert on his late night talk show, and he talked about the liking of the tweet. They showed a screenshot of the Newsweek article on the screen, but sadly, no mention of the fact that this was all related to a video on the David Pakman Show. Here's a bit of the video from Stephen Colbert.
This week, it got even worse when Melania liked a tweet calling Trump a hypocrite on his immigration policies titled, "How exactly did Melania Trump get an Einstein visa?" Yes, Melania may be questioning her own citizenship. Relations between her and Donald have gotten so bad, she's hoping ICE will intervene.
So yes, the tweet said, "How exactly did Melania Trump get an Einstein visa?" That was our video title, but no mention of the David Pakman Show or of our video. It's a missed opportunity. I'm sort of bummed about it. I don't really think Stephen Colbert did anything wrong. I'm not mad. There's no conspiracy to avoid mentioning the David Pakman Show, but it was an opportunity. We could have just as easily been mentioned as easily as we weren't mentioned, I guess is my point. It was our video title there. And in the end, it's not like we broke the story about Melania's Einstein visa, right? We covered it, and it happened to be our video that Melania Trump's Twitter account liked. So listen, it was a valiant effort. I hope that we have another opportunity to be featured on the Stephen Colbert Show, not because I committed some strange and depraved crime, but because of something positive that took place on the show. And a lot of people on the David Pakman Show subreddit believe that there was some deliberate effort made here not to mention independent media, but I don't think that's the case at all.
Yeah, I guess there are two ways to look at it. One is that Stephen Colbert is trying to set up his joke quickly just to get to the punchline.
Yeah.
And, we got left out.
Sure.
The skeptical way to look at it is that legacy media is just ignoring us because they see us as beneath them.
Yeah, and even more cynical, I would say, arguably, that would be the perspective. Yeah, I don't think it's the latter. I think it's just, it was not necessary to include us in order to get to the joke he was telling. And by the way, I tuned out as soon as the Melania Trump impersonator came out. I immediately stopped caring.
Yeah, I didn't think that was that funny. It would have been better, I think, if they showed clips of the show and pointed out this is what Melania Trump liked on Twitter. That's bizarre.
That would have been much better for us, that's for sure. Yeah, but not the way it went. Send me your thoughts. Check out the clip online. You can see it in its entirety. I'm on Twitter at @DPakman. The show is on Twitter at David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new member of the day is Greg Genest, and today's sustaining member of the day is Tom DeRoche, who's been with us since August of 2011. It's not just the new members that keep us going, it's the sustaining members as well, and I can't thank everybody enough who supports our program. Greg, Tom, thanks to both of you. And everybody now can get 40% off of a new membership by using the coupon code VOTESOON18 at davidpakman.com. You can also make a pledge of as little as $1 a month through Patreon at patreon.com/davidpakmanshow. Big announcements coming from the world of Patreon and membership very, very soon. I want to follow up on something I sort of started talking about last week. Last week during the notable Reddit discussion story, there was a post I mentioned on our subreddit called, "Is the left taking anti-Semitism seriously enough?" And there's actually a bigger specific story here, which is that of Louis Farrakhan's involvement in the Women's March. The Women's March has been a remarkable example of activism in the Trump era. Even if I've had specific criticisms of some particular marches in the past, the political engagement that Trump has catalyzed is great. Of course, assuming it leads to voter turnout increases in 2018 and it moves the needle in terms of getting these right-wing nuts out of elected office. But the Women's March big picture is a really great thing, despite my sort of micro criticisms of it. But the Women's March has some major problems. And one of those problems is something that I've identified among a strain of the left for a long time. And to put it in the most charitable terms, it's the indifference to extremely anti-Semitic elements in their ranks. Many of the Women's March leaders are directly connected to one of the most notorious anti-Semites in American culture from the last several decades, and that is the leader of the Nation of Islam, Louis Farrakhan. And this guy is undoubtedly a massive anti-Semite, a disgusting and vile Jew hater. Both the Anti-Defamation League and the Simon Wiesenthal Center are unequivocal on this. And it's not a new thing, right? You go back to 1985, and Farrakhan said of the Jews, "And don't you forget, when it's God who puts you in the ovens, it's forever." Skip ahead 30 years to March of 2015. Farrakhan accused Jews of being involved in the September 11th attacks. Farrakhan has called Adolf Hitler a very great man. In his speech last month, he described the powerful Jews as his enemy, and he actually sort of looked back nostalgically at the anti-Jewish statements of President Richard Nixon and the Reverend Billy Graham, who recently passed away. It's a very, very long list, and the Nation of Islam is an organization which he leads, and it's all just filled with rampant anti-Semitism. There's no denying that. And three of the women involved at the top level of the Women's March are directly tied to Farrakhan: Linda Sarsour, Carmen Perez, and Tamika Mallory. And I have said for years that anti-Semitism is a blind spot for some left-wing activists. And this came to a head last week when Farrakhan, as I mentioned, spoke at the Nation of Islam's Savior's Day. And he again talked about satanic Jews, saying when you want something in this world, the Jews hold the door, white folks are going down, and Satan is going down. And Farrakhan, by God's grace, has pulled the cover off of that satanic Jew. And I'm here to say your time is up. This is the anti-Semitism and the straight-up racist nonsense that this guy has been perpetrating for decades. Anyone with actual progressive values or any Western liberal values whatsoever should condemn it, and it should have, the Women's March should have nothing to do whatsoever with Louis Farrakhan or with his organization, the Nation of Islam. But this is barely registering with some of these so-called leftists. Some examples: Tamika Mallory recently asked about Farrakhan's statements, and here's what she came up with on Twitter. "The black community is very complex. We have been and continue to suffer through incomparable circumstances. This means other people may not understand how we organize and all that it takes to deal with our pain. I am dedicated to bringing people together. However, I will not be bullied," presumably into denouncing Louis Farrakhan. So we have to understand that part of the black community dealing with its trauma is to accept an insatiable and violent Jew hater like Louis Farrakhan. Jew hatred from Louis Farrakhan is necessary to work through the injustices that have been perpetrated on the African-American community. That's not my flavor of the left. It never will be, and I'm sorry if that angers you. I mentioned Carmen Perez. She was asked about Louis Farrakhan and his connection to the Women's March, and she said, "In regards to Minister Farrakhan, I think that is a distraction. People need to understand the significant contributions that these individuals have made to black and brown people. There are no perfect leaders. We follow the legacy of Dr. King, which is Kingian nonviolence. We say we have to attack the forces of evil, not the people doing evil. We never attack people." Well, then it sounds like Louis Farrakhan's ideas are merely not compatible with the ideas that you're claiming to follow, and you should make that clear and show that that level of hatred has no place at the Women's March. To say that Farrakhan is a distraction is just not adequate. How can we on the left correctly criticize the alt-right for their ties to and their indifference to ties to white nationalists without denouncing and ostracizing and alienating someone like Louis Farrakhan, who makes statements that are very similar to the anti-Semitic conspiracy theories we hear from the alt-right? When on the right they admire Hitler, we say, oh, that's a discrediting point of view. Yet we have someone on the supposed left in Louis Farrakhan who said Hitler was great, and you have the leaders of the Women's March refusing to denounce him and his connection to the march. That's not a part of the left that I'm ever going to be a part of. Now, I know that the reaction to this commentary, I'm ready for it. I'm going to get emails from people saying, David, you're ignoring the good things Farrakhan has done for the African-American community. That will be a sort of lighter criticism. I will be called a white supremacist, or I will be called misogynistic or racist because I am telling women what they, quote, should do. That is absolutely ridiculous. That is the exact type of attempt to silence someone based on identity that the left is supposed to be against. And if these Women's March leaders were tied to someone who had made equivalent comments to Farrakhan's about black people, about Hispanic people, about foreigners or the disabled or whatever group of people, this would not be accepted. But that's exactly why we need to make sure that this blind spot for anti-Semitism on the left is not ignored. That's what I'm doing. And you know what? I'm ready. I'm ready for the comments I'm going to get from people saying, David, you don't have a right to say that. What you're saying is white supremacist. What you're saying is misogynistic. No, what I'm saying is Louis Farrakhan is a disgusting anti-Semite, and no one on the left who is looking to create a movement that is respected should have any association with this guy whatsoever. Those are the facts, and if you want to try to discredit me based on my identity, I'm ready for it. I'm not going to be surprised, but I don't really think that that's an argument. Speaking of anti-Semitism, invariably, indubitably, undoubtedly, in situations where blame needs to be placed, where responsibility needs to be determined, there's a fallback called blame the Jews, and there could be no more perfect scapegoat for Russian meddling in the election, and that is exactly where Russian President Vladimir Putin is now going. Putin was recently interviewed by NBC News' Megyn Kelly. He was asked about election hacking, and he said, quite frankly, it wasn't Russians in the government, and really they probably weren't Russians at all. They were probably Ukrainians, Tatars, or Jews with Russian citizenship. Let's check out the clip. You're going to hear voiceover translation of Vladimir Putin to English.
If the 13 Russian nationals plus 3 Russian companies did in fact interfere in our elections, is that okay with you?
I don't care. I couldn't care less, because they don't represent.
You couldn't care less.
They do not represent the government. I could not care less. They do not represent the interests of the Russian state. Maybe they're not even Russians. Maybe they're Ukrainians, Tatars, Jews, just with the Russian citizenship. Even that needs to be checked. Maybe they have dual citizenship, or maybe a green card. Maybe it was the Americans who paid them for this work. How do you know? I don't know.
Super dangerous and disgusting, and not without historical precedent. One of the underpinnings of the environment that led up to the Holocaust was the idea perpetrated early by the Nazis that the Jews weren't really German, right? I mean, after all, a lot of them were speaking Yiddish, not German. They had a different religion. They had different food. It was a common thread in the lead up to World War II. And in a way, it's sort of the perfect scapegoat for a foreign power like Russia that is accused of supporting a candidate with a big anti-Semitic contingent himself in the alt-right for Donald Trump. It's a great way to keep appealing to Trump's base, right? Make them less hostile to Russia. Float the idea that it might have been the Jews that did it. And yes, the Tatars and the Ukrainians as well. But that doesn't trigger the same visceral response in some of Trump's base that blame the Jews triggers. And it is just perfect for Trump's white nationalist fan base because they've had to consider the Russia story on the one hand and the Jewish conspiracy stories separately. Now, Putin is saying, hey, connect the two. Connect the Russia story, which they already don't want to believe, to a Jewish conspiracy. It is like alt-right white nationalist bingo, and it's going to make the alt-right Trumpists love Putin even more. But I want to take it a step further, right? every day it becomes more and more clear that there were many cooks in the kitchen when it comes to Russian meddling and interest in impacting the American elections. So in the strictest sense, there were probably some Jews involved, some Jewish Russian oligarchs who were part of the entire thing incidentally, as well as all sorts of other Russians, right? So of course, the idea that the Jews did it is there's some Jewish conspiracy to do this rather than, well, there were a bunch of people involved, some non-Jewish Russians and some Jewish Russians and some others, but the Judaism isn't really relevant to their involvement. This is just perfect. And you can tell when you watch this stuff, Putin just loves lying to people's faces and just seeing what he can get away with. It's all an effort to be intentionally provocative. And there's one other analysis of the Jew card being pulled, and I don't know if you'll agree with it, but I'll mention it to you. I got a couple emails saying, David, when you hear the Jew card pulled, it reeks of desperation. I don't really think so. Putin has no reason to be desperate. He's not the one who's being investigated by Robert Mueller, who's actually at any kind of legal risk. For Putin, it's all fun and games. He successfully sort of called into question or pushed into turmoil the American election system. I don't think Putin has any reason to be desperate because the guy's just not at risk of anything bad happening to him. If anything, he benefits from people seeing the U.S. as chaotic and unable to keep outside influence out of its election. So I tend to disagree with that, but let me know if you disagree. A lot of discussion about this on our subreddit at davidpakman.com/REDVIT.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
I'm joined today by Jacki Schechner, who is a former CNN and current TV correspondent, now serving as the editor-in-chief of InvestigateRussia.org, the name of a website which will be very interesting to some in our audience and will be very angering to some in our audience. So, I mean, big picture, what are you seeing now as the big storyline in the Russia investigation? Because there's so many angles. There's the so-called collusion, which is a very big umbrella term. There's possible crimes that might have been committed in the attempts to suppress whatever took place, financial crimes, all of these different lines. I mean, how are you thinking of it big picture?
Well, I think it's important to note the way that we're thinking about it big picture is this is a major national security issue. And I want to make that point very clear, right? This isn't a Republican issue or a Democratic issue. It's not a partisan issue. It's about the national security of the United States. And if we had had tanks in the streets, if we had bombs dropped on the United States, there would be a rallying cry. But because this is happening in cyberspace, because it's happening in a less tangible form, we're not seeing the same rallying cry and the same pressure basically on leadership, on the president, to do something. So the way that we're looking at this now from our perspective is, you've got the intelligence community saying unanimously, yes, Russia attacked us during the last election. They're not showing any signs of slowing down. They're going to do it again in 18 and 20. And we need leadership at the top to do something about it. And the president, frankly, is not. So what we're looking at it from is do something, right? Implement sanctions or, come out and publicly say something, at least be in support of what the intelligence community is advocating. But there's been no direction to do that. And that's where I think we're most hung up right now.
Do you think that part of the reason that it's not sort of being taken more as a red alert, as you're sort of alluding to, is because of the online nature of some of the initial hacking? Because there's lots of not online stuff that took place, right? I mean, the meeting in Trump Tower that was certainly set up via email between the Russian lawyer and Manafort and Donald Trump Jr., et cetera. It was an in-person meeting to talk about dirt on Hillary and the possible intimated quid pro quo of easing Russian sanctions. Like you would think that that would be real enough for a lot of people, and yet you still have contingents of the left and right that sort of refuse to admit anything's going on here.
Yeah, I think it's hard to admit that you were influenced by an outside source. I think that's part of the problem, right? Is there's a lot of people who are supporters of the president who say, I wasn't influenced by Russian propaganda. The Russians didn't change my vote. They didn't affect my vote. And so I think there becomes an issue with trying to understand how that surreptitiously happened and how people don't want to admit that they've made a mistake or they've been influenced in some way. I think it takes a very strong person to say, yes, I was influenced and I feel bad about that, or I'd like to rectify that in some way. And so I think what happens is, because all of that influencing happened on a very subtle level, or not so subtle, but we weren't really paying attention to it or looking for it, that it's hard to get people engaged in that admission and then to say, okay, what do we do with it from here? But I think it's important to point out, I just want to add this, is that there's a long history behind this. And I think what gets lost is, because we don't have a lot of time to talk about it, is why Vladimir Putin is so interested in infiltrating our democracy and trying to really undermine the West, and why he's so despised Hillary Clinton. So I think that if you get into the history of why this happened, it's easier to understand how it took place, why it was so many years in the making, and what the impetus was behind it, and why, frankly, it's a very good strategy for Vladimir Putin, because it doesn't cost a lot of money. It allows him to be disruptive. It allows him to attack NATO, to attack Western democracies, and the way that Russia's going to get stronger if it doesn't have the financial resources or economic resources to do that is by dismantling its enemies.
And a lot of that, I think, Jackie, which I've been talking about also, is sort of the geopolitical perception of Russia around the world. And if you go back and read that book, Foundations of Geopolitics from the 90s, it specifically says that the approach of Russia towards countries, the bigger Western democracies like the United States, should be to just try to sort of create chaos, make it appear as though the most fundamental democratic institutions are maybe not as solid as the countries actually doing the voting would like to believe, and that sort of by comparison, it makes Russia appear both more stable and sort of more of a geopolitical authority. Do you think there's something to that?
Absolutely. I mean, there's authoritarian control in Russia. And if you remember, Vladimir Putin was trained as a KGB spy. He's always going to be KGB. And he likes to maintain power. I mean, he's going into an election now where there's no real opposition. He's got allegedly 80% approval rating. But he's got such control over the country that there's really no opportunity for opposition. And the one man, Navalny, Alexei Navalny, who's really posing a threat to that authoritarianism, has been banned from running against Putin. So there is outrage and there is uprising, but it's being quashed as best as Putin can. And thanks to the internet, we're getting more and more information about it. But there's a whole generation of young Russians who want democracy, who want the freedom to protest, who want the opportunity to speak freely about what they believe is corruption in their society. And they're not able to do that. But the more that Putin and his allies and the oligarchs who run Russian society are able to dismantle, or at least give the impression that they're dismantling Western democracies, the more power they're able to consolidate. It makes Putin look stronger to make the U.S. look weaker.
I'd love for you to address a very specific sort of contingent of the left. And this is not the contingent of the left that thinks there is no story, period, right? I'm not super interested in really addressing that group, but there's a very specific group that says, yeah, something shady went on here, and it's not clear if it was the actual coordination, but maybe the firings and the sort of pattern of obstruction, or this might reveal financial crimes that may have taken place, whatever. But their main criticism is it's a waste of time for media outlets, both corporate and independent, to talk about this because there are many other important issues to discuss. Where do you fall on that? What is the validity and importance of covering the trajectory of this investigation?
Oh, I would say we're not covering it enough. I mean, I think that this is really an inherent national security issue. And part of our mission, and I think should be the media outlets' mission, is to spread information, because the more educated we are, the better news consumers will be. And yes, there are a bunch of issues, but we can multitask as a nation. And frankly, I mean, I was a registered independent for a very long time because I was a journalist. And you were always taught that if you were a journalist, you should be registered independent so as not to give the impression of any kind of political bias. I registered as a Democrat once I got into advocacy a bunch of years ago in healthcare reform because I wanted to have an impact on the primaries. So I am registered now as a Democrat, and I consider myself progressive, but we can multitask. That's the nature of our party. And I mention that because we've always been a big tent party. And part of the problem, I think, on the left is that we have trouble sticking to one narrative because there are so many varied issues. The right's very good at message discipline because they have a very set I would say a very narrow highway of issues that they're concerned about, and it's very easy to get everybody on message and pushing in the same direction at the same time. Because we tend to be more of a big tent party and more open to other people's ideas, we do get distracted, and it's hard to catch one narrative. But I would advocate that yes, it's important. It's important because we may have corruption at the highest levels of government, and because it's a major national security issue. If we continue to be influenced by foreign powers, we can easily descend into an authoritarian regime or a kleptocracy, or whatever we're on the verge of right now will continue to operate in the shadows if we don't continue to elevate it into the light.
As far as the nitty-gritty of this investigation, what's your assessment right now of who is most at risk of indictment?
It's such a good question. I am so enveloped in this day to day. And I always say to people, if you like spy novels, if you like CSI, if you like Law and Order, like if you're into this sort of like murder mystery intrigue, you should be following all of the ins and outs of this investigation, because it's got everything. I mean, now you've got poison spies in Britain, and this isn't the first. There was a death in DC of the founder of RT and Putin's media guy that seems awfully suspicious. I mean, when you dig into the details, just the mystery and the intrigue of it alone is fascinating. I think Kushner's in trouble. I think that there's a blurring of his financial interests and government foreign policy. Obviously, Manafort's in big trouble. And I do believe that Manafort's in big trouble with some higher ups in other countries. I think he's less afraid of Trump than he is of the Russian oligarchs and the Russian mob. But these are all my conjectures based on just the information that I've read. Megyn Kelly did that long interview with Vladimir Putin, and I was frustrated because she previewed it on Chris Matthews, and she said something about, she gleaned from her interview that Putin's got something on Trump. And I was waiting in that interview to see what that was.
Yeah, it wasn't there.
She didn't show anything. And that was so frustrating because I actually have gleaned that as well, but I could have said that, and I can't say that based on anything definitive. I can only say that based on kind of my conjecture and the amount of research that I've done in guiding this project. So yeah, I mean, I think we all think that there's some financial stuff there. And if you go back, there's an amazing timeline that we're really excited. We're going to co-opt it and put it on our site. It's going to have a new home. It's the Stephen Harper Bill Moyer's timeline. Mm-hmm. And we're going to absorb that into CIR. And if you go back and you look, I mean, Trump's connections to Russians and Russian money goes back into the 80s when he had a Russian mobster essentially buy a bunch of condos in Trump Tower. This money entanglement for him goes way, way back. And I think, following the money is exhausted rhetoric at this point. I mean, we just keep saying it over and over again, but I think it's totally true.
Last thing in the brief time we have left, Jackie, could this all just sort of evaporate? Like, this is as far as it's going to go. The charges we've seen in indictments so far will be it. And beyond that, we'll get some kind of report that, yeah, there was non-criminal coordination, and that's as far as it's going to go, no further charges? Or does that seem increasingly unlikely to you?
Hey, look, I mean, maybe I'm being overly optimistic, but I don't think Robert Mueller is going through all this trouble to just end here. I think he's got it. I think he's gonna create an airtight case. I think our biggest problem right now is Congress. I mean, I think what you have is a Republican Congress that is unwilling, for whatever reason, to stand up to President Trump. I think they know there's corruption. I mean, people forget that Devin Nunes, who's the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, was on the Trump transition team.
Right.
I mean, he's not carrying water because he just kind of likes the guy. Like, there's something there. He knows something. And I think people need to keep that in mind, is the people who are carrying water for the Trump administration at this point on this particular issue and who aren't representing the interests of the American people have an investment somewhere. And I think that that's where we need to keep our eyes.
Yeah, which makes it even more important, as I've been saying, whether it's net neutrality or this investigation or whatever, got to vote in November, right? There's no excuse at this point not to vote.
And it's not hard. It's not difficult. I mean, there is disenfranchisement going on.
Yeah.
But stand in line. I mean, we stand in line for less important things. I mean, people really need to turn out. I mean, we can get Trump's tax returns. We can get impeachment proceedings started. Like, we can get things moving, but we have to have a majority, and we need to turn out and vote in order to do that.
Jacki Schechner, check out investigaterussia.org. Thanks so much for your great work, Jackie.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I'm having fun.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
While claiming publicly that there is simply no Russia story and the investigation by Robert Mueller is a witch hunt, Donald Trump's lawyers are now privately trying to negotiate a deal with Robert Mueller where Trump would be interviewed by Mueller, but in exchange, Mueller would agree to end the investigation potentially within 60 days of the interview. It's so ridiculous that I can barely even tell you what it is they want with a straight face. This is a story that the Wall Street Journal broke. And what they're saying is that Trump's lawyers want to get things set up where Mueller would get an opportunity to interview Trump, maybe in a highly restricted setting or where certain things would be off limits. But then they would have, like, for example, 60 days to either file charges or end the investigation. So far, nobody has commented about this idea to the Wall Street Journal. And I've said it before and I'll say it again. This is not how innocent people behave, right? Innocent people don't try to put timelines for an investigation to end. Innocent people don't go in and ask for deals. Innocent people don't assail the character and integrity of the investigators. If you haven't done anything, you don't need a deal. You don't ask for a deal. You don't make a deal. And yeah, I'm not talking about the sort of plea bargain industrial complex that happens at the very low level that is terrible for poor people and people who can't afford lawyers. I'm talking about at the level on which Donald Trump is operating. You would say, if you really wanted to show your innocence, that you look forward to the investigation concluding, that you look forward to being cleared, and that in the meantime, you will cooperate fully and focus on your legislative agenda. That's not what Trump's team is asking for. What they're asking for is, we'll talk to you, but you got to stop investigating us, even though the whole point of the interview is figure out whether you should be investigating Trump. You can't make a deal to determine when a federal investigation into the crimes you might have committed will end. And my hope is Robert Mueller would not accept that. And even the concept of trying to make a deal before there are charges is more proof that either Trump understands nothing, which I think is probably true, and or that he has a really guilty mind. And I actually started thinking even more cynically, and I started wondering, is this a sort of non-offer as a first step to justify firing Mueller, right? Laying the groundwork to say, look, we offered him an interview. They didn't agree to it, which of course Mueller can't agree to just end the investigation in 60 days. This thing appears to just be getting started, and then using that as a possible justification to fire Mueller. Why is everyone in such a rush though, right? Benghazi took years and years, and Republicans didn't even get all the investigations they wanted. We had years of oral sex investigations related to Bill Clinton. Why shouldn't we be taking our time on this one, especially since we now have a steady flow of, 17 indictments, 15, 16 indictments at this point? And I saw a funny comment, which is that Trump is going through the stages of grief. First, he denied no collusion. Then it was anger, tweeting in all caps, it's a witch hunt, attacking Mueller. And now we're moving literally to bargaining, the third stage in the 5 stages of grief, which is, I might be willing to be interviewed by you if you end the investigation. If he's following this path, next would be depression, which according to some, he's already well on his way towards. And at the end would be acceptance. And maybe at some point he's going to have to accept that he's going to have to be interviewed under oath without a precondition that they wrap up the investigation right after the interview.
Yeah, but depression and acceptance, that doesn't really seem like Trump.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't at all. Although it seems like he is sort of depressed all the time. Like he's retreating into his own world and just watching hours of TV or whatever. I don't know.
Yeah, this is very bogus, I think.
You think that the request is bogus?
Yeah, like what could they offer Mueller? It's not like you can just pay him off. He's working for the government after all.
Yeah. I think that the big question will be whether ultimately Trump is subpoenaed formally, at which point his legal team would have to come up with legal reasons not to be interviewed by Mueller. And I don't know if that's going to happen. But big picture, people don't seek out deals for totally made up hoaxes and witch hunts that have no merit, right? They seek out deals when they are or think they might be chargeable with some kind of crime. There is a new wrinkle I want to tell you about in the Donald Trump Stormy Daniels fiasco. Ton of emails over the weekend saying, David, you've got to cover the paternity angle to the Trump Stormy Daniels affair. And there is a paternity angle. So far, the lines of questioning have been, one, Trump's personal hypocrisy, right? running on being the guy for the religious right, the family man, the good guy, despite having had multiple affairs, including with porn stars. Angle 2 has been the legality of the hush money paid to Stormy Daniels, possibly coming from campaign funds, $130,000, which would be illegal. Angle number 3 have been the lies and the attempts to cover up the payment that was made. But there's maybe a new angle here, and it's being called the paternity angle. And MSNBC's Lawrence O'Donnell pointed this out on Twitter over the weekend, where he said, Mr. President, why does your confidentiality agreement with Stormy Daniels forbid her to reveal paternity information? Now, this is true that the non-disclosure agreement, which we've seen because it's part of Stormy Daniels' recent lawsuit, it says she is forbidden from disclosing both paternity information and discussing alleged children stemming from her affair with Trump. So the immediate reaction was, this must relate to a love child that Donald Trump has, or maybe to an abortion that Donald Trump encouraged Stormy Daniels to have, or paid for Stormy Daniels to have. But it appears that it's totally overblown, because according to Stormy Daniels' own attorney, Donald Trump never impregnated Stormy Daniels, nor are there any kids in question here, nor any abortion that took place. Her lawyer said, in general, the stock boilerplate language for a fair non-disclosure hush money payments includes that you don't talk about possible impregnation, paternity, or any children. What kind of a world do we live in that there is a boilerplate, a fair non-disclosure contract that includes the provisions that you can't talk about impregnation or love children that may have come from that? Bottom line, I don't believe that there's a kid here. Doesn't really make the entire Stormy Daniels thing any less outrageous overall. And I want to mention, this is sort of a good opportunity for me to mention, the real story here isn't that Trump had an affair with a porn star or with anybody else. That really is Trump's business. It's the hypocrisy of running as the candidate for the moral Christians. It's the Christian voters ignoring the reality of Trump's life because I guess they prefer Trump's unchristianity rather than Hillary Clinton. It's the cyclone of lies and hypocrisy and possibly illegal payments. That's the story, not that Trump had an affair.
Yeah, I think it's the campaign finance violations. But
well, yeah.
I am going to disagree with you a little bit.
Okay.
I don't think Trump ran as the family values candidate. I just think that the evangelical right adopted him for whatever reason. It's not like he was talking so much about, fidelity and
but hold on a second.
Abortion and all that stuff too much.
Trump chose to say that his favorite book is the Bible.
Yeah, with 2 Corinthians.
It's clearly not true. That's a choice he made. He didn't need to do that for the evangelicals to say, this is going to be our guy, instead of Ted Cruz or whoever else. I think you're right that because of their hatred for Hillary Clinton and just like the propaganda around voting for Democrats, there were people on the right who just said, we're going to adopt this guy because he's the Republican. But Trump was pandering as well.
A little bit. I don't think he ever made the best case. I just think that the evangelicals were eager to adopt someone
other than Hillary.
Yeah, and they liked his personality.
I guess. Yeah, I think there's probably plenty of blame or responsibility to go around, depending on which word you want to use. Okay, we've got a voicemail number. That number is 2192-DAVID-P. Here's someone who believes I am a hypocrite. That's nothing new. Let's take a listen.
Hey, David. In the March 9th show, it seemed like you were talking about how labels are not terribly useful in political discussions and that you would rather talk to somebody about their beliefs against yours or ideas against yours.
Right.
But when you had David Rubin on, it seemed that you were pretty dead set on establishing what classical liberal should mean, and you kind of seem to focus a lot on the label at that point. So I wondered if there was an inconsistency there and what you might think. Thanks. Bye.
Yeah, well, no, so that's exactly right. I had Dave Rubin on, and I said, let's forget about the label of classical liberalism for a second. What are the policy positions and the ideas and the principles that are important to you? So I think I did exactly what I told that caller last week we should be doing, which is, fine, pick whatever label you want, but let's figure out how that is defined and what your political positions are. So I think maybe it's an attempt to call me a hypocrite, which is not really an example of me being a hypocrite. And there are plenty of examples of me being a hypocrite. You should talk to talk to people in my personal life. But at least as far as this goes, I don't think there is any evidence of hypocrisy.
Are you being condescending to the voicemail caller? We got a live call about that last week. I hope you're not being that way.
Not at all. I think that they're just wrong. I think they're flat out wrong, and I'm willing to say it. We've got a great bonus show for you today. Get access to the bonus show. Become a member. Become a patron. Both great ways to get access, and we'll speak to you then.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.